Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the thick, smoky air of the medieval world. Not the grand tournaments or nightly romances, but something quieter, stranger, and a little bit foggier. You find yourself walking through a stone hallway lit by flickering torchlight, the scent of old parchment and incense mingling with something more peculiar, an herbal sweetness clinging faintly to the air. Your eyes water slightly. Is that lavender? Maybe. But there's also something sharper, something suspiciously giggly. Tonight's story isn't about who wore the fanciest armor or who won the loudest war. No, tonight's about how getting high, yes, truly altered in mind and mood, was, well, surprisingly common back then. From monks with herbal visions to peasants experimenting with garden weeds, the medieval world was far more elevated than the dusty textbooks let on. Now, to be clear, the Middle Ages weren't exactly one long, slow-motion rave under cathedral ceilings. But you might be surprised how often people were tripping, sipping, sniffing, and swallowing things that either numbed their pain or sent them stumbling toward strange revelations. Whether by ritual, accident, or curiosity, altered states of consciousness were everywhere. And you probably wouldn't survive one of their normal days without a mild sedative either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're settling in, drop your current location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from, and what kind of sleep schedule we're accidentally syncing up with. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander into a monastery library. The stone walls keep it cool even in summer, and there's a hush in the air that feels deeper than silence, like thought itself might echo. One monk adjusts his robes and opens a drawer beneath a lectern. Inside, neatly wrapped bundles of herbs. Some for incense, some for tea, and some for visions. Yes, you heard that right. Monasteries weren't just about plain bread, long prayers, and illuminated manuscripts. Some monks were herbalists, and not just peppermint for your cold kind. Of herbalists. These guys cultivated visionary plants. Peschiamus, belladonna, wormwood, names that sound poetic, but were often powerful psychoactives when brewed just right. Not all monks took them, of course. But for the ones who did, the goal wasn't recreational in the modern sense. The idea was union with the divine, unlocking clarity or revelation during long fasts or overnight vigils. If you've ever tried staying awake for 48 hours while chanting psalms and staring at a candle flame, well, your brain starts doing its own interpretive dance anyway. Add some herbal assistance and you're suddenly weeping at the feet of a vision of St. Mary made of golden honey. Mainstream historical records note the use of mandrake, for instance, in monasteries as a sedative. That's putting it kindly. Mandrake was so strong it had to be suspended in wine or soaked in milk to avoid killing you, which monks knew and used. Carefully. Usually. There are even accounts of monastic visions that include floating lights, unexplained warmth, or the presence of angels. Historians still argue whether these were genuinely mystical experiences, or the side effects of fasting, sleep deprivation, and, a strong mug of monk-made mugwort tea. And yes, mugwort. It shows up in medieval monastic texts as a protector against demons and nightmares. often tucked under pillows but sometimes brewed. In small amounts it relaxes. In larger doses, it opens the doors to dreams that bleed into waking. What's fascinating is how rarely this was condemned. Medieval religious orders had a strangely open attitude toward substances that helped deepen prayer, so long as you weren't partying or selling it at the fish market. The line was blurry, but it existed. As long as your vision stayed inside the chapel, all good. Now, not every monastery dabbled. Some orders were stricter than others. The Cistercians, for example, were famously austere. Think plain porridge and lots of shivering. But even among them, herbal gardens were maintained. For healing. And let's just say a lot of those herbs had dual purposes. Calendula for wounds. Poppy seed for dreams. And when night fell, candles flickering low, shadows dancing on rough stone walls, you can imagine the silence broken only by a sigh, a prayer, and the occasional startled gasp as someone, deep in meditation, suddenly saw a light no one else could. Did they see God? A dream? A trick of herbs and hunger? That, my friend, is the blurry beauty of the medieval high. You wake before dawn, tucked beneath wool blankets in a stone guest room of a Levantine monastery. A bell rings somewhere outside. The air is dry, dusty, and heavy with something sweet, like burned leaves with a whisper of spice. You follow the scent down a corridor lit by oil lamps, passing frescoes of saints with wide eyes and golden halos. You enter a tiled courtyard, and there, beneath an archway of carved cedarwood, two men sit in silence, passing a small clay pipe between them. This is the world of hashish, and in medieval Holy Lands, it had a complicated reputation. Hashish, made from the resin of the cannabis plant, had been known and used in parts of the Islamic world since at least the 9th century. It wasn't universally accepted, but it wasn't entirely outlawed either. In some places, it was considered a healing herb. In others, a path to spiritual ecstasy. And in still others, a threat to order and dignity. Sort of like dancing at weddings after one too many goblets of fermented camel's milk. You're probably wondering how this tied into religion. Well, it's messy, like most human things. Some Sufi mystics used cannabis derivatives like hashish in their rituals, believing it brought them closer to divine love or helped them dissolve the ego. The whirling, the chanting, the music, and yes, sometimes a puff or two. Scholars still argue whether this was symbolic, widespread, or exaggerated by later writers, trying to paint all mystics as stoners in sandals. But the effects were real enough to earn official attention. Certain empires cracked down on hashish, calling it a distraction from proper worship. Others looked the other way, especially when it seemed to keep restless townspeople content during times of famine or political instability. In Cairo, reports of hashish cafes pop up as early as the 13th century, frequented by everyone from laborers to poets. One scholar described the patrons as floating between poetry and sleep. Not a terrible way to spend your Thursday night, honestly. And then there were the legends. You've probably heard of the Hashashin, a group of medieval assassins who were said to consume hashish before their missions. The name itself might come from their alleged drug use, or it might not. Historians debate this fiercely. Some think the connection was slander invented by enemies. Others say the tales have a kernel of truth, though exaggerated. One 12th century chronicler described an assassin as walking like a man who had no fear of death, or pain, or weight of body. Maybe it was hashish. Maybe it was conviction, or maybe both. Interestingly, European crusaders who came into contact with hashish culture were both fascinated and horrified. They brought stories back to Europe about Saracen potions that clouded the mind and opened dark visions. These tales helped frame cannabis as something exotic, dangerous, and alluring. Perfect for both scaring peasants and entertaining dukes. In the Islamic world, attitudes toward hashish swung back and forth over the centuries. At times, it was widely used, even among scholars. At others, banned and burned in the streets. Religious jurists wrote heated opinions on whether it caused true intoxication, since alcohol was strictly prohibited, and whether its use constituted a moral failure or a minor sin. No one quite agreed, much like today, honestly. And so here you are watching two men in robes pass a pipe under a star-filled sky, murmuring verses of poetry between puffs. One of them smiles as he quotes Rumi, "Don't get drunk on wine, get drunk on love." But in the dim lamplight, you suspect he's getting just a little drunk on both. Even in the medieval world, people reached for altered states, not to escape reality entirely, but to tilt it slightly, soften its edges, and maybe find something transcendent hiding just behind the curtain. So, next time you hear someone say the Middle Ages were dull, grim, and sober, remember this courtyard, this laughter, and that thin line of smoke curling into the desert dawn. The sun hangs low over a crooked thatched roof, and the scent of yeast and boiled grain drifts from an open window. You walk past the mossy stones of a village lane and pause outside a cottage where laughter bubbles inside. A woman in a stained apron stirs something in a steaming cauldron. This, my friend, is no witch's hut. This is the home of an alewife, and if you're lucky, she might offer you a cup of her latest batch, with a little extra something. In medieval Europe, ale wasn't just a drink, it was the drink. Water was unreliable. Wine was for nobles and monasteries. Ale was what most people drank all day, every day. It was thick, warm, and brewed at home, mostly by women. These women, called alewives, didn't just follow recipes, they improvised. And sometimes the additions to the brew were more than just barley and hops. That's where things get interesting. You see, the herbs they used weren't always mild. Before hops became the standard bittering agent, brewers often relied on what's called grut, a mix of local plants and spices. Think yarrow, mugwort, juniper, henbane, mandrake, and even belladonna. All real plants, all potentially psychoactive in the right dose. Now, not every village brew turned your brain into a kaleidoscope. Most gruit herbs just added flavor or mild relaxation. But there are historical cases, scattered across England, Germany, and Scandinavia, of ales that caused dizziness, hallucinations, or unexpected giggle fits. Whether by accident or design, alewives held powerful knowledge, which plants to stir, when to boil, how much to use, and when to warn the drinker not to stand up too fast. And yes, men brewed too. But women dominated the domestic brewing scene. For centuries, their secrets passed quietly, sometimes only to daughters or apprentices. Which is why, when the church or town officials cracked down on unholy practices, these women were often the first targets. A strange brew and a confident woman. Clearly a witch, right? Historians still argue whether the inclusion of hallucinogenic plants in ale was common practice or just rare local tradition. Some say it was mostly accidental, herbs misidentified, or mixed carelessly. Others suggest that at least in some regions, ale was intentionally spiked to lift the spirits during festivals, funerals, or long cold winters. In parts of Germany, there are records of wild beer recipes causing visions of fire and snakes. That's specific. And here's where it gets even more fun. The line between sacred ritual and casual brewing wasn't always clear. Ale brewed for a midwinter feast might carry extra mugwort to open the heart. A funeral ale might include henbane to help mourners see the passing spirits. Whether those visions were metaphorical or not. Well, you tell me, after your third cup. One quirky fact. In some towns, alewives marked their doors with a broomstick, propped above the entrance. Not because they were witches, but because it signaled ale ready. That's right. The origin of the witch's broom might be less flying through the night, and more grab a drink, love, the batch just cooled. And then there's the ale tasting ceremony. In a few scattered accounts, local elders or priests would bless the new brew by sampling it. Some would claim to feel lightheaded and mystically joyful. Others would simply fall asleep in the corner. You duck inside the cottage now. The fire crackles, and the room is thick with the smell of herbs and wet grain. The alewife hands you a wooden cup. "Careful," she says with a sly smile. "This one's strong. It'll help you forget your debts, or remember your dreams." You and sip. Warmth floods your chest. The room tilts just a little. The shadows around the hearth stretch longer than they should. Someone laughs in the other room. Or maybe that's a goat? The Middle Ages weren't colorless. They weren't flat. And thanks to women like her, the world occasionally shimmered, just a bit after sunset. The sun has barely cleared the horizon as you follow a farmer along a narrow path, bordered by hemp stalks swaying in the wind. Tall, green, and fragrant, the plants are sturdy, fibrous, and deeply unassuming. "For rope!" the farmer grunts. "And cloth and sails," he waves his hand dismissively. "Not for smoking." But his smirk lingers just a little too long. Cannabis. The humble hemp plant, grown across medieval Europe from the Italian hillsides to the foggy fields of England. Cultivated primarily for industrial purposes, yes, but also quietly, curiously for something more. Let's untangle this knot. Hemp was everywhere. It was critical to daily life. Ropes for ships, thread for clothes, oil for lamps. It even made its way into early medicinal texts. Hildegard of Bingen, the famed 12th century abbess and polymath, described cannabis as a healing herb. She recommended it boiled for poultices and applied to the skin to ease pain and inflammation. Very practical, very tame. But the line between medicinal and mind-altering isn't always clear. You take a seed here, a flower there. Dry it just right, crush it with a little animal fat, maybe add it to wine or oil, and suddenly, that healing salve makes your afternoon chores feel like you're floating over the field instead of trudging through it. Here's where it gets murky. Historians still argue whether cannabis was regularly consumed in a psychoactive way in medieval Europe. The evidence is patchy. Some say yes, pointing to Arabic medical texts that made their way to Europe, detailing cannabis-infused confections and potions. Others insist it was only ever used externally, never smoked, and never, ever ingested in a way that would lead to euphoria. But then, there are the clues no one can quite ignore. In several old European apothecary manuals, cannabis is listed alongside opium, henbane, and wormwood, all known for their intoxicating or sedative effects. In one 14th century Italian recipe, cannabis is blended with wine and left to steep under moonlight. Romantic, sure, but also suspiciously specific. Then there's the church. Interestingly, there's no blanket medieval condemnation of cannabis, which is odd, considering how quick ecclesiastical authorities were to ban pretty much anything that made people feel too good about their bodies. Some scholars suggest this silence means it wasn't on the church's radar. Others wonder if small-scale recreational use was simply tolerated, so long as no one danced naked through the village square. And let's talk about smoking. Was it a thing? Technically, no. Europeans didn't adopt the practice of pipe smoking until after contact with the Americas. But herbal fumes? Absolutely. Cannabis was sometimes burned as incense. Whether the smoke was inhaled on purpose or just incidentally wafted through a crowded bathhouse is anyone's guess. One quirky tale comes from a 15th century Bohemian physician who described a green powder sprinkled over heated stones during therapeutic steam baths. He noted that participants reported euphoria, giggling, and momentary forgetfulness. He called it a purging of sorrow. He didn't name the powder. But, come on. Meanwhile, over in the Islamic world, where cannabis use was more openly discussed, travelers and merchants brought stories, sometimes even seeds, back to Europe. And while customs agents weren't exactly sniffing for hash at the border, cultural exchange has a way of slipping through the cracks, especially when someone says, "You really must try this sweet cake." Still, mainstream historians remain divided. Was cannabis ever smoked or consumed recreationally in medieval Europe? Or was it strictly industrial and medicinal? The answer, frustratingly, may be yes, and no, and maybe. And that's the thing about history. It rarely gives you a clean confession. Sometimes it just leaves behind a crumpled recipe, a stained page, and a curious glint in the farmer's eye. You linger in the field a bit longer, brushing your fingers along the fibrous stalks. One of the farmhands lights a small brazier nearby. The smoke rises slowly. "Keeps away flies," he says. Sure it does. You wake to the sound of drums in the distance, slow, pulsing, rhythmic. The air carries a heavy scent of wood smoke and moss. As you follow the winding trail through a clearing ringed with standing stones, you see flickers of firelight, figures in woolen cloaks, and something bubbling in a carved wooden bowl. Welcome to the lingering echo of Europe's pagan past, where rituals met mushrooms, and highness was a form of holiness. Before Christianity swept across the continent like a slow, stern wave, Europe was a patchwork of tribal beliefs, nature-worshipping traditions, and seasonal ceremonies. And while records from this pre-Christian period are understandably sparse, no one was live tweeting the Beltane bonfire, archaeologists and anthropologists have pieced together compelling clues that many of these rites involved, well, getting a little weird with nature. One of the most whispered about substances, Amanita muscaria, the bright red mushroom with white spots, famously associated with reindeer, shamans, and, oddly enough, Santa Claus. This mushroom appears in Siberian and Norse traditions, and scholars speculate that its use might have spread further west, into the Celtic fringe and other forested corners of medieval Europe. Now, Amanita is not your friendly neighborhood mushroom. It doesn't just chill you out. It can cause vivid hallucinations, altered perception of time, bodily distortion, and, if misused, vomiting, sweating, and a strong desire to never, ever do that again. But in the right dose, with the right ritual, under the right moon, it was a gateway to visions, to gods, to stories that shimmered between the trees. Some traditions involved boiling the mushrooms into teas or soaking them in animal fat. Others included drying and eating small portions during solstice ceremonies. There are even reports of shamans ingesting the mushrooms and their followers drinking the, how to put this gently, filtered results. Nature's second pass, you could say. Historians still argue whether that was a real practice in medieval Europe or just a myth recycled from Siberia. But mushrooms weren't alone in this sacred snack aisle. Other plants, like mandrake, henbane, and datura, were believed to open portals between worlds. Used carefully, they could lead to visions. Used carelessly, they could lead to a rapid trip to the afterlife. Some ceremonies centered around burning these plants, letting their smoke drift through sacred groves. Participants would chant, dance, and sometimes collapse, later claiming they had spoken to their ancestors, or the moon. The Christian Church wasn't a big fan of these lingering traditions. Many were absorbed, transformed, or outright banned, but traces remained. In some regions, villagers still gathered herbs under the midsummer moon, and elders whispered plant names that weren't taught in monasteries. You'd hear stories of dreams that predicted storms, or a girl who saw her dead grandmother after sipping a tea made by the oldest woman in the village. Were these hallucinations? Sleep paralysis? Grief-fueled fantasy? Or was it the datura again? One fringe belief among modern ethnobotanists is that many so-called fairy sightings in medieval folklore, tiny glowing beings, strange music in the woods, loss of time, might be linked to accidental ingestion of psychoactive plants. Think about it. You're a lonely shepherd, you eat a berry that looks like a currant, and suddenly the trees start whispering your name. Quirky fact, in Wales and Cornwall, some fairy rings, those perfect circles of mushrooms, were believed to be portals. Stepping into one might bring madness, or joy, or eternal sleep. No one really agreed, so naturally some people tested it, with mixed results. So here you are now, standing at the edge of the firelight. The drums are louder. Someone is ladling the mushroom broth into carved wooden cups. The night smells like smoke, pine, and something floral and strange. A girl beside you laughs at nothing and twirls once, twice, then stares at the stars like she's never seen them before. You don't sip. Not yet. But you realize something. The Middle Ages weren't just about prayers and plagues. For many people, they were also about finding wonder. Sometimes in the woods, sometimes in a dream, and sometimes in a mushroom that made the stars sing. You sit at the edge of a crowded square, the hum of a market winding down around you. Fishmongers packing their stalls, children chasing chickens, someone loudly regretting their fourth cup of mead. A physician in a thick brown robe hurries past, holding a bundle of wrapped herbs and something small in a glass vial. You watch him disappear into a side alley, and you wonder, not for the first time, was that for pain or for pleasure? Welcome to the slippery overlap between medieval medicine and mild intoxication. Because when you live in a world of bloodletting, bone sores, and prayers as prescriptions, you'd be surprised how many people preferred a different kind of relief. One that made the pain melt away, or made the room spin just enough to forget the problem entirely. Let's talk about opium. Yes, that opium. Derived from the poppy plant, its milky latex was a staple in the medicine cabinets of many medieval healers, used to treat everything from toothaches to fevers to melancholia. It dulled pain, calmed nerves, and helped patients sleep. And if a little was good, a little more, well, that depended on how much you valued your next morning. Mainstream texts like those of Avicenna and later medieval European physicians describe opium as a gift of the gods, but it came with warnings. Dosage mattered. Human grain too much, and your fever was the least of your problems. But opium wasn't the only guest at the medieval pharmacological party. Let's not forget belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. In small doses, it was used to relax muscles, reduce inflammation, and even dilate pupils, which was considered fashionable in some courts, because nothing says beauty like giant, unfocused eyes. But belladonna is finicky. It can lift you gently into bliss, or drop you into a hallucinatory fugue where time folds in half, and your cat starts quoting psalms, and then there was Datura, the troublemaker. It blurred lines, slowed the heart, and occasionally made users believe they were birds, literally. There's a record from a German town in the 14th century where several people flew off rooftops during a village feast after ingesting a datura-laced cordial. 2 sprained, ankles, 1 broken leg, and no one could remember what they'd been celebrating. Now here's the twist. Many of these substances weren't only used in medical emergencies. Wealthy nobles, bored, pampered, and always chasing novelty, occasionally indulged in court entertainments involving exotic substances. Picture a noblewoman reclining on a velvet cushion, sipping a syrupy infusion prepared by her private apothecary. She blinks slowly, smiles at a tapestry that suddenly looks very animated, and begins composing a poem to a talking goose. Quirky fact: there was once a trend among some European aristocrats to test the effects of new substances on condemned criminals. "Drink this," they'd say, "and tell us how it feels, before the execution." Ethical, no. Informative. Sometimes. Historians still argue whether this blurry boundary between medicine and mild euphoria was socially accepted, or simply tolerated. In court, of course, everything was spun as intellectual curiosity. "She's not high, she's experimenting with humoral rebalancing." Right. And don't forget the traveling performers, the minstrels, jesters, and snake oil peddlers, who sold miracle tonics in the town square. Many of these elixirs included poppy extract, cannabis resin, or alcohol spiced with stimulating herbs like betony or valerian. One 15th century English street seller claimed his potion could ease, pain, cure heartbreak, and improve one's singing voice. Reviews were mixed. You step into the alley now, following the path the physician took. A small wooden door swings open. Inside, shelves are stacked with jars, powders, dried roots. The air is thick with the smell of crushed anise and vinegar. The apothecary smiles as you enter. "Looking for relief?" he asks, then adds with a wink. "Or something a bit more interesting. You're not sure." But as he holds up a small bottle filled with reddish syrup, your head tilts. The label reads only, "Night Tincture," in a time when the line between pain relief and a party trick was blurred by candlelight and desperation. People sought more than healing. They sought escape. They sought dreams. And sometimes they sought that tiny moment of floaty, foggy peace in a world that rarely offered any. You're in the grand hall of a castle now. Long wooden tables strewn with bones and bread crusts, goblets tipped sideways, minstrels packing up their lutes. The feast is over, but a strange hush hangs in the air. A nobleman slouches on his throne-like chair, eyes glazed, murmuring about flying pigs and rivers made of honey. A servant tries not to giggle as she carefully removes his turkey leg scepter. No, this isn't just the aftermath of too much wine. Welcome to the forgotten world of medieval, party tricks that doubled as pharmacological experiments. When medicine met mischief and pain relief often slipped right into intoxication. Because in the medieval mindset, if you were going to numb a toothache, why not numb the rest of your thoughts while you were at it? Let's rewind. The medieval. Noble class had access to more than gold, silk, and poorly trained falcons. They also had access to apothecaries, imported herbs, and traveling physicers who sold tonics from across the known world. Opium, saffron, cannabis, datura, and even rare imports like nutmeg and betel nut. Spices with properties far more interesting than flavor, especially when steeped in wine, which they often were. It was common for hosts to offer spiced wine at banquets, sometimes to aid digestion, sometimes to impress guests, and sometimes to see who might start speaking in tongues before dessert. These weren't the cozy mulled wines of winter markets. They were dark, bitter, and laced with herbs that promised relaxation or clarity of mind, depending on who you asked. One 14th century noble described his post-banquet dreams as a parade of foxes dressed as bishops. Delightful, and here's where things go sideways. Nobles had time, money, and far too many reasons to escape the crushing boredom of protocol. You had to bow this way, eat that way, speak only at the third toast. Unless, of course, you happen to drift into a different state of mind entirely. Helped along by a cordial that burned going down, but left you humming Gregorian chants in reverse. One strange, but well-documented substance used at court was theriac, a complex medicinal compound originally intended as a cure-all antidote. Made from dozens of ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, ginger, and occasionally bits of viper flesh. Don't ask. Theriac was taken in small spoonfuls and believed to protect against poison, plague, and heartbreak. But when consumed a bit too liberally, hallucinations weren't unheard of. A warm fog of euphoria, one user wrote, like being wrapped in invisible fur. Historians still argue whether nobles intentionally pushed these elixirs into party mode, or simply accepted the side effects as part of the experience. After all, when the same syrup could ease a headache and make you see angels, it was hard to complain, and nobles weren't the only ones in on the secret. Court jesters, those brightly dressed, sharp-tongued performers, were often in possession of the most experimental concoctions. Some historians believe they dabbled with herbs to heighten their humor or survive the tedium of constant performance. There's even a record of a jester named Renat, who, after drinking a mug of infused honey wine, spent 20 minutes conversing with his own shadow, and won the favor of a king who'd previously tried to fire him. Quirky fact. One recipe for a relaxing cordial found in a 13th century Italian manuscript includes wine, rose petals, poppy syrup, and powdered coral. Coral. You're not supposed to drink coral, but apparently that didn't stop anyone. And remember, medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't isolated from pleasure. The two blurred constantly. A tonic could ease your stomach and make you giggle uncontrollably. A poultice could heal your bruise and cause vivid dreams of talking donkeys. It was just the way things worked. So now, as the fire crackles low and the nobleman hums softly to himself, something that sounds suspiciously like Greensleeves in falsetto, you begin to understand the medieval way of coping. When the world is unstable, the food is bland, and your physician tells you to balance your humors with powdered emeralds and goat bile. Sometimes a spiced wine laced with opium sounds like a reasonable Tuesday. You step into a dimly lit room, tucked behind a medieval city square. There's a thick velvet curtain, a narrow staircase, and a carved wooden sign that reads simply, Apothecary. Inside, it smells of cinnamon, crushed leaves, and something vaguely animal. Shelves line the walls, each filled with jars, bottles, powders, and small wax-sealed satchels. Behind the counter stands a thin man with ink-stained fingers and half a smile. He nods at you. You looking for a sleeping draught? Or a dreaming one? This is the world of the medieval apothecary, where medicine was art, science, alchemy, and occasionally, accidentally or otherwise, a ticket to another plane of reality. Most people came in for remedies, of course. Headaches, coughs, toothaches, melancholy. But depending on who you were and what you whispered across the counter, there was often more on offer than just healing. Take the sleeping draught, for example. It was a popular request. Who wouldn't want? To sleep through tooth extraction or the throb of a broken rib. A common recipe involved poppy syrup, hemlock, henbane, and mandrake, all plants with sedative and hallucinogenic properties. Carefully dosed, They could ease you into a dreamless sleep. Just a little too much. And you might dream of flying over cathedrals before never waking up at all. Mainstream records tell us that drafts like these were given before surgeries, rudimentary though they were, or during extreme illness. Physicians wrote about the opiate wine or syrup of poppy with reverence and fear. Administered correctly, it was a gift. Improperly, a very medieval farewell. But some customers weren't ill. Not physically. They came to apothecaries for relief from heartache, anxiety, spiritual confusion, what we might now call emotional distress. For these clients, a different kind of draft was offered. One not just to knock you out, but to invite in dreams. Dreams that spoke, that healed, that revealed something. One quirky recipe from a 14th century Parisian shop claimed it could send the soul walking. It contained, among other things, saffron, nutmeg, powdered seashell, and a pinch of solanum, a nightshade relative. 1 spoon, the notes warned, for sleep. 2 for visions. 3, and you meet your god. And yes, that was handwritten in Latin with tiny skull doodles in the margin. Medieval humor. These drafts weren't advertised, of course. They were offered quietly, discreetly, often in exchange for favors rather than coin. An apothecary who knew the dreamers in his town could gain a kind of quiet power. He knew who wanted to forget, who wanted to feel, who wanted to remember something that had never really happened. Historians still argue whether apothecaries were considered just pharmacists or low-key therapists with access to the early Renaissance version of a psychedelic toolkit. Some claim they were no better than snake oil peddlers. Others point to their meticulous records, blending ratios, and shocking accuracy in herbal dosages as evidence of true scientific minds. And then there are the artifacts, hidden inside drawers. Of preserved apothecary cabinets across Europe are still traces of rare herbs, some long since outlawed for their effects. Dried henbane leaves, crystallized poppy extract, resinous cannabis clumps. Traces that suggest these drafts weren't myths, but everyday tools for navigating pain, trauma, and the unpredictable emotional whirlpool of medieval life. Quirky fact: in Bologna, one apothecary ledger from 1471 records an unusually high number of night elixirs sold during a particularly long winter. The margins are filled with doodles, sleeping faces, stars, and, amusingly, a very confused-looking goat. One scholar speculated the whole city was mildly stoned until spring. You sit now at the edge of a wooden bench inside that shop, cradling a small cup of something amber-colored. The apothecary raises an eyebrow. "Sip slowly," he says. The dreams come in waves. You lift the cup, the scent of anise and crushed petals rising up. It tastes warm, bitter, floral. The corners of the room soften. A candle flickers. Someone, somewhere, hums a lullaby in a language you don't know, and as your limbs grow heavy, your thoughts begin to drift. Not away, but inward. The apothecary watches quietly, then returns to his shelf, whispering, "Safe travels." The bell tower strikes noon, but the town square is anything but ordinary today. You hear it before you see it. A rising rhythm of feet on stone, gasping voices, and the strange, insistent scrape of shoes that won't stop. You push through the crowd to witness it. Dozens of people, arms flailing, heads lolling, bodies drenched in sweat, spinning and stomping in wild abandon. Their eyes are distant, their mouths slack, some laughing, some weeping, and none of them able to stop. Welcome to the phenomenon known as dancing mania, perhaps the most chaotic, confusing, and yes, possibly drug-induced public event in medieval history. It happened in waves, across centuries. The most infamous cases hit Europe between the 13th and 17th centuries, with outbreaks in Strasbourg, Aachen, Cologne, and beyond. These were not organized festivals. They erupted spontaneously. One day a few people were dancing in the street. By nightfall, hundreds joined. Sometimes the dance lasted for hours, sometimes for days. Occasionally someone collapsed and never got back up. Theories abound. Was it spiritual possession? Collective hysteria? A form of protest or social release? Historians still argue whether these were true medical epidemics or simply moments of mass catharsis, fueled by social stress, hunger, and trauma. But one particularly trippy possibility keeps popping up in the scholarly debate: ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye grain, especially during wet summers. It contains alkaloids chemically similar to LSD. Yes, that LSD. Consuming bread made from infected grain could cause convulsions, hallucinations, paranoia, and the sensation of insects crawling under the skin. Delightful, really. And in towns, struck by famine or bad harvests, there wasn't much choice about what bread you ate. So now picture this. A village survives a harsh winter. The bread tastes odd, but it's food. Within a few days, people are twitching, laughing, crying, moving. One woman claims she saw St. Vitus dancing in her dreams and can't stop swaying to his rhythm. Others join her. A drummer appears, then a fiddler. By noon, it's a full-blown ecstatic procession through the streets. Church bells ring not for prayer, but to try to stop the madness. Quirky fact. In Strasbourg in 1518, a woman named Frau Trophia began dancing in the street. She didn't stop for 6 days. By the end of the month, over 400 people had joined her. The city council, unsure what else to do, hired musicians, believing the only way to cure the dancers was to let them dance it out. It did not help. Some dancers claimed they could see things: angels, devils, rivers of light, golden animals. Others said their bodies felt like sacks of feathers or furnaces of joy. Others just screamed and collapsed. The church blamed demons. Physicians blamed hot blood. Locals whispered about cursed bread or vengeful saints. But the records don't lie. Something strange was happening, and it happened more than once. Historians are divided. Was it ergotism, mass hysteria, or a bit of both, stirred by stress, religious fervor, and a whole lot of questionable grain? You stand on the edge of the chaos now. A boy spins past you, laughing through tears. An older man waves his arms like wings, mumbling about flying fish. A woman collapses nearby, only to rise again, grinning, barefoot, and blissful. And the music? It's everywhere. Drums, claps, bells, chants, not rehearsed, just felt. In a world where most joy was rationed, and life was bound by rules of labor, silence, and submission, these moments of abandon were more than spectacle. They were escape. Maybe holy, maybe poisoned, but undeniably human. As the dancers whirl into dusk, the sky turns gold, and for a moment you swear you see a halo around every spinning form. Or maybe that's just the bread you ate earlier. Either way, you don't move. You just sway. You wake to a strange sensation. The lingering scent of beeswax and herbs, a cold draft across your skin, and something greasy under your fingernails. You're lying on a straw-stuffed mattress in a dim attic chamber. Candlelight flickers, casting shadows on the low wooden beams. And there, beside you on the floor, is a pot of thick greenish ointment and a broomstick lying curiously close. Welcome to the curious world of witches' flying ointments, a blend of folklore, pharmacology, in perhaps one of the most misunderstood highs of the medieval age. Let's start with the legends. By the late Middle Ages, stories were circulating across Europe of witches flying through the night, sometimes alone, sometimes in covens, riding broomsticks, staves, or even butter churns, off to secret sabbats with the devil himself. These tales were so vivid, so consistent, that inquisitors wrote entire manuals explaining how witches performed their airborne mischief. Now the rational brain says, okay, this is nonsense. People can't fly. But then someone turns up a 15th century manuscript describing a topical salve made from herbs like belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and datura. Herbs that, when absorbed through the skin, can induce vivid hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and a sensation of floating. Interesting coincidence, right? These flying ointments were said to be applied to the body, often in warm places, use your imagination, to bypass the digestive system and enter the bloodstream more efficiently. And the effects? Chillingly specific. Accounts describe users feeling weightless, leaving their bodies or dreaming of flight through forests and over rooftops. One Italian inquisitor noted a woman who confessed, "I dreamt I flew on a stick through the sky over the valley where I met others who danced around a horned beast." She swore it happened. Whether it did in body or only in mind is debatable. Historians still argue whether these ointments were actually used, or whether the confessions were extracted under duress and influenced by inquisitors' own expectations. Some suggest that many so-called witches were simply herbalists experimenting with psychoactive plants. Others point to records of accidental poisonings, especially among midwives and cunning women, as evidence that yes, people were mixing things that made them fly. Or fall. Quirky fact, one 15th century German herbalist's notebook included a recipe titled Unguentum volandi, the flying ointment, with cheerful little stars drawn in the margins. Its ingredients included fat, usually animal, mandrake, root, belladonna, wolfsbane, soot, and a pinch of graveyard moss. For best results, apply under a full moon and don't eat anything first. Even modern pharmacologists admit, if this combination were applied to the skin, it could indeed cause intense hallucinations, disorientation, and temporary amnesia. A ride, to be sure, though perhaps not the kind you'd enjoy without a mattress nearby and the broomstick. There's a theory, somewhat awkward but fascinating, that the application of these ointments was, let's say, not always with the hands. Broomsticks may have been more than symbolic, which might explain why early woodcuts show witches straddling them, not just riding through the air, but half entranced, eyes rolled back, floating on their own private journeys. You glance down at the ointment pot. It's half empty. A strange smile tugs at your lips. Somewhere far off, you hear a whispering wind and a low hum, almost like singing. The room tilts. Is it the herbs? A dream? Or just the weight of 1,000 stories you've heard whispered since childhood? In the flickering candlelight, the shadow of the broomstick stretches across the floor like a road to somewhere else. And you understand something. For those labeled witches, poisoners, or madwomen, the world was already upside down. So why not rise above it? You shuffle into a cold stone chapel on a damp autumn morning. The pews creak, the air smells of mildew and old incense, and the stained glass windows let in just enough grey light to cast soft shadows across the altar. A priest murmurs, Latin, in a low, steady chant. But the real show isn't up front, it's in the back pew, where a woman trembles violently, her eyes locked on something no one else can see. She whispers something about angels with molten wings. Then she laughs, quietly, and doesn't stop. This isn't possession. This isn't prayer. This, friend, is ergotism. You've probably heard of ergot by now. Remember that dancing mania. In Strasbourg, same fungus. It grows on rye. Loves damp weather, invisible to the eye, deadly to the mind. But today, it doesn't sweep across a town like a plague. Today, it's quieter, stranger, more. Personal bread was the medieval staple. If you ate it all, you ate bread. Usually rye because it was hearty and could survive poor soil. But if the harvest was wet or the grain stored improperly, ergot could sneak in, and you wouldn't know, until it was too late. There were two types of ergotism, both equally terrifying. The first, convulsive ergotism, which caused muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and a sense of limbs burning or crawling. People would writhe on the ground, scream about phantom beasts, or see fire raining from the sky. Not exactly ideal for a Sunday sermon. The second kind was gangrenous ergotism, often called St. Anthony's fire. This one was even nastier. It constricted blood vessels, leading to blackened fingers, rotting toes, and, eventually, spontaneous amputations. People literally lost limbs while still alive. But oddly, many reported feelings of euphoria and vivid visions as it progressed. As if the brain, aware of its decaying body, decided to throw a farewell party in Technicolor. Monasteries linked to the Order of St. Anthony actually specialized in treating these cases. Their hospitals offered healing salves, warm beds, and better bread. Because once people stopped eating the infected rye, many symptoms faded. But not all. Some sufferers carried visions with them for life, both divine and demonic. Historians still argue whether ergot was recognized as the cause. Some medieval physicians noticed the link between bad bread and outbreaks. Others thought it was divine punishment, or the devil's whisper. In some towns, bakers were blamed and even executed. In others, it was the millstones they smashed, believing the evil lived in the grain-grinding machinery. And there's a third theory, whispered only in back rooms and among alchemists, that some people knew what ergot did, and chose to use it. Carefully, just enough to unlock visions without melting their insides. A risky gamble, sure. But in a world where dreams were divine, and the spirit world felt only a heartbeat away, it was tempting. One peculiar story from 15th century Switzerland tells of a nun who claimed to receive nightly visions of angels, warning her about plagues and fires. She wrote down her experiences in excruciating detail, describing geometric patterns, golden beasts, and a long tunnel of light. Modern analysts think she may have consumed ergot-contaminated bread during a fasting ritual. The angels? Side effect, or side benefit, depending on your theology. Quirky fact, the term holy fire was sometimes used not just for ergotism, but as a poetic metaphor for divine inspiration. The line between illness and revelation was thin. Burning with fever might be possessed. Seeing saints in the candle smoke might just be lunch. Now back in the chapel, the woman in the pew begins to sing, a soft, repetitive melody in a language no one recognizes. A monk gently places a hand on her shoulder. She doesn't flinch, just smiles, and keeps singing. You look around. No one stops her. Some even close their eyes listening, as though they too want to glimpse the strange light that lives behind the veil of rotten rye. The snow crunches under your boots as you make your way up the hill toward a crumbling hermitage. Wind howls through bare branches, and somewhere in the distance, church bells toll as if underwater. You reach the summit and see him, a solitary figure in threadbare robes, arms outstretched to the sky, eyes wide open, mouth forming words you can't hear. A halo of frost glistens in his beard, and his face wears the kind of joy that doesn't belong in this cold, brutal world. This is not just prayer. This is ecstasy. A medieval state of spiritual rapture that, when described plainly, sounds suspiciously like someone tripping on something they picked out of a monastery herb garden. The Middle Ages had more than its fair share of mystics. People who claim to speak directly with God, see visions of heaven, or feel their souls leave their bodies entirely. Many were canonized. Others were quietly tolerated. A few were locked up. Because while the Church celebrated spiritual devotion, it grew very nervous when things got too weird. And yet, the stories persist. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, that genius of music, medicine, and theology, wrote of luminous visions filled with shimmering tongues and spirals of fire. Saint Teresa of Avila later described her experiences as a combination of burning sweetness and a dart of love that left her soul in bliss. Beautiful, vivid, also kind of psychedelic. Historians still argue whether these experiences were divine or drug-induced, or simply the result of extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and deep meditative focus. But the overlap with known symptoms of psychoactive substances is hard to ignore. Bright lights, out-of-body sensations, euphoria, time distortion, all familiar to both mystics and modern psychonauts. Take Julian of Norwich, for example. During a near-death illness, she claimed to receive 16 showings from Christ. Her descriptions are full of rich sensory detail, colors, movement, a sense of cosmic warmth. She wasn't accused of heresy. She was revered. And yet her experience reads like something born in a fog of herbal tea, brewed with ingredients best labeled, "Do not exceed 2 teaspoons." One fringe theory suggests some mystics may have unintentionally ingested hallucinogenic compounds via ritual wine, smoked, herbs, or fasting-induced hypersensitivity. Others argue some knew exactly what they were doing and considered the altered state part of the pathway to God. And then there were the laughers, that's right. Laughter was seen by some mystics as the purest form of release, an uncontrollable joy that bubbled up when the soul brushed against the divine. One obscure 14th century text from France records a nun who would laugh for hours after prayer. As if possessed by honey, she claimed angels were telling her jokes. Her confessor, confused and a bit embarrassed, simply noted, "No sin found." There's a quirky tale of a Saxon monk named Brother Arno who, after sipping a mysterious wine given to him by a traveling pilgrim, proceeded to give a sermon entirely in bird noises. The abbot was furious, but the younger monks said it was the most inspiring mass they'd ever attended. You sit now at the foot of the hermit's hill. He's still in place, motionless but radiant. The wind has calmed. Snowflakes swirl gently around him like tiny glowing relics. He opens his eyes, finally. Meets your gaze. "There's a door," he whispers, inside the silence. Then he turns and walks away, humming a tune that sounds older than time. Was it faith, madness, or mugwort and honeymead? Hard to say. But for those mystics, that fleeting rapture, that taste of something more, was proof enough. They didn't need to explain it. They just needed to feel it. And if a few plants helped, well, maybe that was part of the divine design. The torchlight flickers off the barrels in the castle cellar, casting tall shadows that dance on the damp stone walls. You descend the narrow stairs behind a grinning steward who carries a copper jug and a pouch that clinks faintly with dried herbs. At the base of the stairs, a heavy oak door swings open, and the scent hits you like a slow, smoky wave. Honey, clove, damp wood, and something sharp. something herbal. Tonight's wine, he says, has a little twist. Wine, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just a beverage. It was a baseline for all sorts of experimentation, especially when it came to altering the mind under the noble excuse of digestion, health, or divine insight. Let's start with a simple fact. Medieval wine was often terrible. It spoiled quickly, was stored in porous barrels, and didn't travel. Well, so to preserve it or disguise its foul taste, people added things: spices, herbs, roots, and resins. This practice, known as hypocras, when done with sugar and spices, became wildly popular. But not all flavorings were innocent. Some of them packed more punch than expected. Wormwood, for instance, was occasionally added to wine for its bitter, in notes and supposed medicinal value. But wormwood contains thujone, a chemical compound that, in high enough doses, can cause hallucinations and convulsions. Sound familiar? It's the same plant later used to make absinthe. In moderation, wormwood gave the wine a sharp, tingling edge. In excess, it turned your post-supper stroll into a floating expedition through the vineyards of your imagination. And wormwood wasn't alone. Medieval wine might also include valerian root, mildly sedative; pennyroyal, known to affect mood and muscles; hyssop, stimulating; or even myrrh and frankincense, not just for mass anymore. These additions gave the drink a medicinal sheen. It's good for the humors, they'd say, while sipping something that might leave you giggling through vespers. Historians still argue whether these additions were aimed at healing, flavoring, or escaping. Recipes vary, some clearly targeting digestion or plague prevention, others suspiciously vague, like the 14th century instruction to add the herb of stars for a gentle lifting of the soul. Sounds lovely, and maybe mildly illegal. One especially quirky practice involved resonated wine, stored in barrels sealed with pine pitch. Over time, the wine absorbed the resin's properties, producing a sharp, almost medicinal taste. Some medieval drinkers claimed it cleared their heads. Others said it made them feel strangely light. One monk described a resonated cup of red as like drinking smoke from a holy fire. And let's not forget the ritual element. In some religious feasts or folk ceremonies, wine was more than a drink. It was a tool. At certain harvest festivals or St. Day vigils, wine infused with joyful herbs was passed around to encourage gladness. The herbs, not always clearly listed. But modern reconstructions suggest things like meadowsweet, slightly euphoric, or even a pinch of henbane in bold villages. Even royalty got involved. A 15th century court record from Burgundy mentions a banquet where spiced wine left several guests seeing great wheels in the sky. Whether that was a comet, a hangover, or a visionary blend of wormwood and bad decisions remains unclear. Quirky fact: there's an apocryphal tale of a bishop who banned twilight wine, a concoction brewed at dusk with sleep herbs, because too many priests had started seeing flaming letters during Compline. He suggested they return to water. They did not. You raise the cup now, warm in your hands. The wine smells strong and strange, sweet at first, then earthy, almost metallic. You sip. A slow warmth spreads down your throat. The candlelight softens. The steward smiles. Don't drink too much, he says. You'll start to see the truth behind the wood. You don't know what that means. But the shadows on the barrel wall seem to nod in agreement. And in this moment, half history, half haze, you realize the past wasn't just blood and parchment. Sometimes it was a really good cup of wine with questionable herbs and surprisingly vivid dreams. The rain comes down in thin, persistent lines as you trudge along a muddy village path. Chickens scatter, a wheelbarrow tips. Somewhere, a baby cries. It's one of those days, the kind when the world feels soggy, grey, and a little too loud. And if you were a medieval peasant, this would just be Tuesday. You pass a hedge where a hunched old woman plucks berries with purple-stained fingers. She offers you a handful. "Belladonna?" she says. "Not too many." Now you've heard of nobles dabbling in dreams and monks chasing visions. But what about the peasants? Surely the muddy, taxed to the bone, illiterate lower classes didn't have time or access for getting high. You'd be surprised. While peasants didn't have dedicated apothecaries or elegant spice racks, they had something even better. Wild. Access. Forests, fields, hedgerows. And local knowledge passed down by mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and gossiping neighbors who knew which root helped with cramps, which leaf dulled a toothache, and which berry would make you see things that weren't there. Let's talk about belladonna, also called deadly nightshade. The name alone should make you hesitate, but it grew wild in much of Europe and was surprisingly well known. In small amounts, it acted as a sedative or muscle relaxant. In slightly larger amounts, well, let's just say the village dog probably started talking to you, and belladonna wasn't the only contender. There was henbane, used in ancient times and never fully forgotten, which caused drowsiness and sometimes full-blown hallucinations. There was datura, which blurred the lines between waking and dream. Even wild lettuce, a relative of the opium, poppy, could be boiled down into a crude tincture known to take the edge off a brutal winter evening. Historians still argue how widespread these substances were among the lower classes. Some claim their use was common but casual, taken more for pain relief than escape. Others believe peasants knowingly embraced the mind-altering effects during festivals, fertility rites, or long periods of grief. After all, when your daily life involves hauling wood, fearing taxes, and burying children who didn't make it past 5. A little detachment now and then might not seem so sinful. One quirky record from 13th century Bohemia describes a man who claimed to have spoken to the moon after chewing the leaves of a plant that made him forget he had feet. The local priest declared it heresy. His neighbors just called it Jacob's usual Tuesday. Sometimes the line between folk remedy and spiritual journey blurred entirely. Women in particular, often tasked with herbal knowledge, carried recipes in their heads. Combinations of herbs, used not only for fevers and childbirth, but also to induce dreams. "Drink this," one old phrase went, "and you will see your grandmother again." Whether that was metaphor or pharmacology is still up for debate. There's also evidence that seasonal festivals, especially those tied to ancient pagan rites, like Beltane or Samhain, included herbal brews shared around fires. These potions were often thick with local flora, and sometimes led to spontaneous visions, ecstatic dancing, or mild prophetic outbursts. And no one batted an eye. It was, and just part of the ritual. Let's not forget the communal aspect. In tightly knit villages, where privacy was rare and secrets traveled faster than the plague, people likely knew who was the one with the dreaming herbs. These figures, half respected, half feared, were often older women. Some called them wise women, others whispered witch, and the church, oh, it wasn't thrilled. It condemned intoxication as sinful and discouraged the use of superstitious herbs. But in practice, enforcement was spotty, especially in rural regions where bishops rarely ventured, and the only thing that kept a baby from dying in winter was a tea boiled over an open fire by someone who knew. You sit now beside a peat fire inside a low cottage. The woman hands you a wooden cup. The liquid is dark, bitter, slightly sweet. Your shoulders relax. The crackle of the fire deepens. Shadows move differently now, gentler, slower. A low hum seems to rise from the earth. She doesn't speak. She just smiles. In a world of hard ground and harder choices, sometimes the simplest gifts, a plant, a story, a moment of peace, were more powerful than prayer. A chill fog clings to the thatched roofs as you walk through the village square, where the tavern is already glowing warm against the morning grey. You push through the creaky wooden door and find a handful of locals sitting in silence, each cradling a cup, each staring into the middle distance as if trying to remember something important, or forget it entirely. Behind the bar, a woman ladles a steaming mixture into earthen mugs. She calls it plague tea. Her smirk says otherwise, because in this moment, you're witnessing what medieval life did best: blur the line between healing and escape. Let's talk about herbs. Not the glamorous ones from the royal gardens, but the scrappy, roadside ones that showed up in every hedgerow, hearth, and feverish dream. For every serious affliction, plague, childbirth, battlefield wounds, there was a corresponding folk. Treatment, and many of these treatments, whether by design or accident, produced more than just comfort. One of the most common crossovers, mandrake root. Now you've probably heard of mandrake, the human-shaped root that, according to legend, screams when pulled from the ground. In reality, it doesn't scream, but its reputation was justified. Mandrake contains alkaloids that sedate, dull pain and, at higher doses, can induce vivid dreams or hallucinations. Monasteries, battlefield surgeons, and traveling healers all used it, usually in wine or oil. But here's the strange part. Some healing recipes use just enough to not knock you out. Just enough to make your world tilt slightly. Pain. Relief. Yes. But also maybe a little cosmic detachment. Then there was henbane, used for toothaches, swelling, and even insomnia. One 12th century physician wrote that it gave patients a smile even as their mouth burned. Another warned it opened the soul's windows, often without invitation. You know, casual side effects. Poppy syrup was a staple too, both for children and adults. It quieted crying, soothed injuries, and made the poor sleep sounder during long, hungry nights. But it also made the dreams come fast and strange. Parents sometimes reported their sick children laughing in their sleep, or talking to imaginary saints. Now here's where it gets interesting. The same herbs show up in recipes meant for pain and for prophecy. The key difference, intent. If a healer brewed valerian root to calm a fevered mind, it was medicine. If a wise woman brewed the same root and told your future afterward, it was magic. And magic, especially the low, quiet kind practiced in kitchens and barns, walked a razor's edge in medieval society. Historians still argue whether people knew they were getting high or whether they interpreted the sensations as divine, spiritual, or simply God's kindness. Some say medieval folks wouldn't have distinguished between a herb's calming effect and a miracle. Others insist they absolutely knew what they were doing, especially during the long, dark plague years, when any kind of relief was welcome, even if it made the goats speak French. A quirky note: in one 14th century English text, a physician describes a woman who, after a dose of foxglove tea, claimed to have met the Virgin Mary in a garden full of singing onions. He does not clarify whether he believed her, but he recorded it. The ritual of medicine in those days was part performance, part comfort. A healer would grind herbs while chanting softly. The pot would simmer over an open fire, and the patient would inhale the scented steam long before sipping the drink. The atmosphere itself became part of the cure. Like modern therapy, but with more wool and less paperwork, You're handed a mug now. It smells like cloves and something earthy. "For the nerves," says the barmaid. You sip. The warmth spreads down your throat, into your chest, into your fingertips. Your thoughts soften. That thing you were worried about? It's still there, but quieter. Around you, no one talks. They just sip and stare, not sad, not joyful, just elsewhere. And in this low, herbal haze, you begin to see how the remedies of the Middle Ages weren't just about curing illness. They were about offering people a window, however brief, out of their daily struggle. Whether the world outside was burning or freezing, sometimes the answer was in the cup, not escape, not enlightenment, just a little less pain. You find yourself beneath a grand stone archway, walking into a palace courtyard where laughter and silk float on the breeze. Peacocks strut, lute music hums in the background, and the scent of foreign spices hangs in the air like invisible perfume. But it's not the music or the gold-threaded banners that captivate you. It's the expression on the nobleman's face as he sips from a carved amber cup. He looks vacant, peaceful, a man far, far away from tax policy and royal decrees. This is where nobility met experimentation, where access to exotic imports and no shortage of free time gave rise to a quiet trend, chasing oblivion, delicately. Being a medieval noble wasn't all feasts and falcons. Sure, they had the power, but they also had the boredom, endless etiquette, fragile alliances, chronic illness, paranoia, and the existential weight of a poorly timed marriage. When life turns into a long chess match with France, it's only natural some nobles started slipping strange things into their wine goblets. And those strange things, they came from everywhere. With the rise of trade along the Silk Road, luxury goods weren't limited to gold and textiles. Nobles gained access to rare herbs, resins and spices from Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, many of which had psychoactive or sedative effects. Some were well known. Saffron, for example, was prized for its warmth and subtle mood-lifting qualities. But others were more mysterious. Take nutmeg. It arrived in Europe in tiny, expensive amounts, praised for its flavor, but when consumed in large quantities, nutmeg can cause nausea, hallucinations, time distortion, and elevated spiritual consciousness, as one 15th century Venetian wrote, though he also added, "Do not attempt again, horrors beyond stars." Then there was mastic, a tree resin used to perfume wine or chewed like gum. Some described it as calming, others said it made the world feel slippery. Did they mean smooth or unstable? The manuscript does not clarify. Betel nut, occasionally imported by way of traders passing through Constantinople, was chewed for its euphoric effects, mild stimulation, red-stained lips, and a buzzing sense of goodwill. One English lord who tried it in the 14th century wrote, "The sun greeted me more kindly than usual." Adorable. Historians still debate how much of this was intentional pharmacology versus nobles just throwing expensive things into their wine and hoping for a good time. But personal diaries, banquet accounts, and letters suggest they noticed when something shifted. One duke described a cordial as capable of quieting the most seditious thoughts, and promptly began serving it at all negotiations. These noble experiments weren't limited to sipping. Perfumed sachets filled with lavender, valerian, and opium were sometimes worn around the neck or placed under pillows. The aim? Better dreams, or fewer intrusive thoughts. Possibly both. And let's not forget sleeping chambers, richly decorated rooms often set apart from the main living quarters, filled with incense burners, soft tapestries, and tiny jars of unnamed salves and resting oils. Some nobles had personal apothecaries who curated evening draughts, often mixed with rose water and honey to hide the bitterness of poppy resin or henbane extract. A quirky tale. In 1391, a Hungarian countess famously hosted a stillness feast, where no one was allowed to speak, and each guest was served a different mood wine. One reportedly burst into song, another slept under the table for 6 hours, and a third claimed to converse with his future self. The event was never repeated, but the wine recipe was copied in 3 languages. Did they understand the risks? Possibly. But nobles lived in a world of high mortality and low medical standards. A touch of euphoria, even if it came with side effects, was often preferable to reality. You lean on the stone railing now, gazing into the courtyard garden. The nobleman with the amber cup still hasn't blinked. A servant gently guides him away. Somewhere nearby, someone is laughing softly, as if at a joke whispered by the ivy. You take a sip of the offered cordial. It tastes of roses, pepper, and something ancient. And for a moment, your limbs grow light. Not drunk, not dizzy, just far away. In a time of rigid structure and expectation, even the privileged longed for silence, for peace, for something just a little bit outside the gilded cage, and they found it. In saffron, in syrup, in the sliver of time between one royal obligation and the next. A bell chimes in the distance as you descend into the dim, smoky chamber of an alchemist's workshop. Shelves sag beneath the weight of dusty books, brass instruments, and a positively concerning number of skulls. A faint blue flame crackles. Under a glass alembic, and over it all wafts a scent that's part lavender, part whetstone, and part, let's be honest, something you should probably not be inhaling. Welcome to the strange and simmering world of medieval alchemists, who, while attempting to turn lead into gold, often brewed potions that turned people into, well, something else entirely. Let's start with what alchemy really was. Part science, part mysticism, part very dramatic fan fiction about nature. Alchemists believed all matter could be transformed, perfected, even human consciousness. And their labs weren't just chemical playgrounds. They were spiritual training grounds. You purified your materials and your soul, hopefully without exploding either. Their quest? The Philosopher's Stone, a mythical substance said to grant immortality, transform metals, and, in some variations, unlock transcendent wisdom. What did they use to try and create it? Pretty much anything. Mercury, sulfur, lead, crushed gemstones, vinegar, and a rotating cast of herbs and spiritual salts that read like the ingredients list on a Renaissance energy drink. And here's the twist. Many of these mixtures had real physiological effects. Some were poisonous. Some smelled awful. But a few altered perception in ways the alchemist didn't always anticipate. One recurring theme in alchemical texts is the idea of spiritual ascent, an inner transformation that parallels the outer distillation of base matter into purity. Descriptions often include phrases like a radiant light behind the eyes, the separation of self from flesh, or the laughing serpent. That last one definitely sounds like someone just licked the wrong stone. Historians still argue whether these effects were intentional or accidental. Some suggest that alchemists unknowingly created psychoactive compounds, especially when distilling essential oils from plants like wormwood, henbane, and mandrake. Others believe the altered states were the result of long hours inhaling mercury vapor in poorly ventilated rooms. A fair point. Take the case of Paracelsus, the 16th century physician alchemist, who once claimed to have discovered an elixir of life made from wine, opium, and something he only referred to as the essence of stars. He insisted it could cure sadness, grant prophetic dreams, and make the user feel bathed in warm silver. Modern chemists suspect it mostly made people lie down and talk about their ancestors for 3 hours. One especially quirky record comes from a Catalan alchemist who brewed a sun potion using rosemary, myrrh, and powdered gold leaf. He drank it during a solar eclipse and later reported seeing the secret clockwork of heaven. He also lost consciousness for 12 hours and woke up convinced he could speak to bees. And let's not forget the language alchemists used. Deliberately. Cryptic, heavily symbolic, and often indistinguishable from poetry. Terms like green lion, philosopher's egg, and red tincture all had layered meanings, chemical, metaphysical, and sometimes pharmacological. You couldn't just read an alchemical recipe. You had to interpret it like a holy riddle. One person saw a recipe for gold. Another saw a tea that could melt your perception of time. These workshops weren't hidden dungeons either. Some were inside noble estates. Others operated under the blessing of monasteries. A few alchemists even had patrons, dukes and bishops, who hoped to strike it rich, or at least get their hands on a love potion that worked this time. You glance over at the glass tube now filling with violet vapor. The alchemist hands you a cup of something warm, metallic, and slightly fizzing. Just enough for insight, he mutters. Not so much for fire. You sip, and suddenly the shelves around you seem to hum. The air ripples. The candle flame stretches sideways, then folds into itself. For a moment, you swear the room is breathing, and the alchemist simply smiles. Because sometimes, in the search for eternal life or hidden truths, people stumbled onto something else. Expanded awareness. A glimpse. A vision. A 3-hour conversation. With a beetle that may or may not have been real. In trying to transmute base matter, they may have accidentally transmuted themselves, if only for an afternoon. The bells of the monastery toll low and slow as dusk settles in. You walk through a candlelit cloister where the stone walls seem to absorb the sound, muting every footstep. Ahead, a sister kneels, eyes closed, lips moving silently. She isn't, praying in words you recognize. Her face is alight with something deeper, distant, and strange. A single tear runs down her cheek. A novice stands nearby, watching with both awe and unease. She whispers, "It's happening again." Welcome to one of the most curious intersections in medieval life. The moment where religious ecstasy and herbal haze begin to blur. Medieval Christianity placed high value on emotional and spiritual intensity. Visions, trances, stigmata, raptures. Mystics were revered, their stories copied into manuscripts and passed from abbey to abbey. They described their experiences in glowing, vivid language, golden light, sweet burning, music no ears could hear. Their bodies trembled, floated, wept, laughed, collapsed. They spoke with angels, sometimes with Christ himself. But here's the strange part. Many of these experiences sound strikingly similar to the symptoms of certain psychoactive herbs, and the overlap wasn't always coincidental. Take mugwort, a common herb with mild psychoactive properties. It was often used in religious rituals and burned during sacred times like solstice vigils. It supposedly enhanced dreams, deepened prayer, and allowed visions to rise more easily. A nun might sip mugwort tea before an all-night vigil, not to get high, but to soften the veil between worlds. Then there's angelica root, often used in monasteries to purify the breath and strengthen the spirit. In large doses, it's a stimulant. Combine it with fasting and long hours of chanting, and you've got a cocktail for altered consciousness. Even incense, especially when mixed with resins like myrrh, frankincense, and storax, acted as a kind of sensory haze. Burned in enclosed chapels with little ventilation, it created an atmosphere ripe for visionary experience. Breathe in deeply. Meditate. Wait. Something comes. Historians still argue whether these effects were intentional. Some suggest mystics knew which herbs helped them reach ecstatic states, but cloaked the practice in theological language. Others believe the effects were merely side products of intense spiritual routines, sleep deprivation, hunger, solitude, and the occasional herbal aid all working together to open the mind like a cathedral window. But some mystics do hint at awareness. Hildegard of Bingen once again spoke of the greenness of the earth as divine medicine, describing plants as helpers of the soul that speak to us in silence. She never directly links herbs to her visions, but her herbarium is remarkably detailed for someone who supposedly floated through most of her revelations. Quirky fact: a 14th century friar named Thomas of Edessa kept a dream journal where he meticulously recorded every vision he had after drinking a clarity draught prepared by his brother monk. His visions included cosmic spiral staircases, glowing-eyed animals, and a conversation with a dove that told him to switch to goat cheese. He was later promoted. One of the more controversial mystical symptoms was holy laughter, a sustained, uncontrollable joy that overtook the mystic during divine communion. Sound familiar? It's also a known side effect of henbane, especially when consumed as a smoke or poultice. And then there's the phenomenon of levitation, mystics who claim to float during prayer. Could this have been a trick of perception, hallucination, or the mind's soaring response to physical and spiritual overstimulation? You sit in the chapel now, watching the candlelight flicker against the stone arches. The nun still kneels. Her breath is steady. Her eyes open slowly. "I saw the golden light again," she whispers, not to you, but to the space in front of her. "It told me, we're not meant to carry so much alone." And for a second, something shifts in the air. The silence deepens. The incense thickens. And whether it's God or mugwort or the fragile mind reaching beyond its limits, you feel it too. In the Middle Ages, divine experience didn't always come from the pulpit. Sometimes it bloomed quietly in a garden, steeped in water, lit with flame, carried on the breath of a girl who simply wanted to feel closer to the sky. The wind tugs at your cloak as you trudge alongside a caravan crossing a dusty ridge. Camels groan, bells jingle faintly. You pass crates marked with strange symbols, spices, silk, scrolls, and something wrapped in waxed cloth that smells curious. A bearded merchant in flowing robes catches your glance and offers a sly smile. "From the east," he says, tapping the bundle. "For dreams, or for dancing, depends how you take it. Welcome to the Silk Road, not just a trade route but a bloodstream connecting the medieval world. Flowing with textiles, religion, knowledge, and yes, intoxicants that changed how people saw the world. Europe didn't invent its mind-altering practices. It inherited and imported them, one caravan at a time. Let's start with the Middle East and Central Asia, regions steeped in herbal lore and rich pharmacopoeias. Traders brought with them hashish, opium, spiced wines, and powdered concoctions, designed to aid sleep, enhance poetry, or facilitate communion with the divine. Along with these came stories of mystics who flew on rugs, saints who saw 1,000 years in an hour, and kings who drank elixirs that made them weep with joy. These weren't just fanciful tales. They were also product demonstrations. Take bhang, a cannabis-based drink from the Indian subcontinent. It arrived in small jars, thick as honey, sweetened with dates or tamarind. Though it wasn't widely understood in Europe, some coastal medical Texts describe a green cordial from the Indies that produced laughter and floating limbs. Likely bhang, or something close to it. From China came knowledge of ginseng, rhodiola, and mahuang, herbs prized for their energy-giving or mind-sharpening properties. They weren't hallucinogenic in the traditional sense, but they altered energy, stamina, and perception of fatigue. For traders facing long journeys or scholars pulling all-night scribal marathons, these were treasured. Even from Africa came substances like khat, a leaf chewed for its stimulant effects, and resins, like myrrh, which, when smoked or steeped, could induce a sense of euphoria or reverent calm. European merchants likely encountered these indirectly, but their reputations grew. Some noble records refer to leaves of speaking light, or sun powders, used in banquets or religious feasts, coded language for imported plant-based. And let's not overlook the books. Alongside herbs and spices came medical manuscripts, translated from Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, and Greek, detailing pharmacological knowledge centuries ahead of Europe's own. These texts included references to substances that enhanced memory, imagination, courage, and joy. By the 12th century, major monastic libraries in Spain and Italy held copies of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which listed opium, cannabis, and mandrake as therapeutic agents. Historians still argue how much of this information was truly understood by European scholars versus simply copied and repeated. Some translations preserved detailed dosages and warnings. Others simply described effects in mystical or poetic terms. "This syrup calls dreams down from the stars," one translator wrote. Helpful. Quirky fact. A 14th century Venetian merchant once returned from Syria with a chest marked, "For sacred use only." It contained dried blue lotus flowers, which, when steeped in wine, produced a mild sedative effect and possibly hallucinations. He claimed it made the hymns more golden. The clergy was not amused. What's fascinating is how ideas about the mind traveled with these substances. From India came notions of inner balance. From Persia, ideas of celestial harmony. From China, metaphors of energy flow. And so European thinkers began to merge foreign plants with foreign philosophies, forming new theories about how herbs affected not just the body, but the soul. You rest now at the edge of a campsite, sitting beside a small fire. A merchant unwraps a fragrant paste and stirs it into his tea. "It opens the heart," he says softly, but not too wide. You take a sip. It's sweet, smoky, unfamiliar. And as the stars spin quietly overhead, you realize something. The world of the Middle Ages wasn't small. It was stitched together with caravans, stories, and substances that blurred the line between here and elsewhere. And sometimes that little bundle in the back of the camel train, it wasn't just cargo. It was someone's ticket to a different way of seeing everything. You're seated on a wooden bench in the scriptorium of a crumbling abbey. Rain patters softly against the stained glass windows, casting red and gold streaks across ancient parchment. A monk shuffles past you, nods politely, and then disappears behind a shelf of herbal codices. Moments later, you hear the soft clink of glass, the whisper of a cork being eased from a bottle, and the faintest exhale, like a secret being released. In this quiet moment, you realize something essential about medieval drug use. The clergy knew more than they let on. Throughout the Middle Ages, monks, priests, friars, and other religious officials weren't just guardians of scripture. They were also keepers of botanical knowledge, often the most literate, educated members of society with access to books, gardens, travelers, and time. And behind those high stone walls, they developed a complicated, often ambiguous relationship with plants that could heal or unmoor the soul. Take monastic herbals, for example. Illustrated guides painstakingly copied by hand. These texts listed plants and their effects with chilling precision. Mugwort for dreams, poppy syrup for pain and nights of unrest, mandrake to soften the mind's teeth, whatever that means. Many entries included veiled warnings, only for the truly sorrowful, or to be taken when the moon is in retreat. Did they know the psychoactive effects? Absolutely. But did they label them as such? Rarely. The language was deliberately slippery, full of euphemisms like clarity of the soul, divine stillness, or visions of the quiet spirit. In some monasteries, especially in southern France and northern Italy, apothecaries were run entirely by clerics. These weren't just medicine cabinets, they were spiritual laboratories. And while most monks followed strict rules about moderation and abstinence, there are records of experimental brews used during vigils, fasts, and periods of intense meditation. One particularly quirky recipe from a Carthusian abbey includes hops, rosemary, valerian, and a drop of myrrh-infused wine, taken before an all-night chant session to encourage divine alignment. The side effects? Reported as looseness of limbs and weeping with joy. Historians still argue how much was shared beyond cloister walls. Some believe the clergy deliberately hoarded herbal knowledge, fearing that common folk might misuse potent plants. Others suggest knowledge flowed more freely through sermons, pilgrim stories, or confessionals where priests whispered advice like, "Boil this with goat's milk, don't ask questions." And then, of course, there were the confiscations. During periods of witch hunting and heresy trials, inquisitors often seized the belongings of accused women and healers. Among the confiscated items, bottles of dark liquid, sachets of dried leaves, unholy oils. Some were destroyed, but many, curiously, were kept, catalogued, and sometimes studied. One inquisitor's notebook from 1482 includes a detailed sketch of a flying ointment and a marginal note. Smells not unpleasant, causes sleep, dream of flames and rivers. Make of that what you will. There's also evidence that some clergy were curious rather than hostile. They didn't see all altered states as diabolical, just dangerous when misused. A nun who saw angels was a saint. A peasant who saw them after drinking henbane tea. Less fortunate. Quirky fact. In one monastery near Cologne, an anonymous monk began keeping a dream log in the back pages of a psalter. Over 10 years, he described visits from shining figures, nights where the stars whispered hymns, and a recurring vision of a bear offering him a chalice. Scholars argue whether this was mysticism, madness, or a nightly dose of valerian and too much honeyed wine. You sit now in the library's hush. A friar nearby adds something dark to his tea, stirring it slowly, reverently. He doesn't meet your eye, but he doesn't hide it either. And in that subtle exchange between secrecy and transparency, between prayer and pharmacology, you glimpse the heart of the medieval church's relationship with mind-altering substances. They knew. They just didn't always talk about it. Because sometimes silence is the best place for visions to echo. You find yourself in a dim tribunal chamber, thick with the scent of damp parchment and sweat. A single torch sputters against the cold stone wall. At the center of the room stands a wooden table piled with evidence. Bundles of herbs, tiny vials, an iron cauldron still stained with residue. A stern-faced inquisitor leans forward and sniffs one of the satchels. Then he turns to the scribe and says flatly, "Witchcraft. Welcome to the shadowed intersection of forbidden knowledge and the Inquisition's curious inventory. A moment in history when spiritual paranoia and herbal experimentation collided with fire, fear, and very peculiar paperwork. During the late Middle Ages, particularly between the 14th and 17th centuries, the Catholic Church intensified its campaign against heresy, superstition, and anything that smelled a little too much like autonomy. This included maleficia, harmful magic, and its supposed tools, potions, salves, and concoctions often made from the very same herbs used in monastery infirmaries or noble gardens. The twist? Many of the items confiscated during witch trials were psychoactive. Let's unpack that. In trial records across Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, we find inventories of witches' belongings that include mandrake, belladonna, henbane, poppy syrup, datura, and mixtures described as dark oils for flying or powder for dreams. Inquisitors often had no idea what these substances actually did, but they noted their effects with awe and suspicion. One inquisitor in 1486 recorded that a woman accused of witchcraft drank a green wine and spoke with the devil, who appeared to her as a goat made of stars. It's more likely she drank a cannabis-infused cordial than made a pact with a cosmic livestock deity. Historians still argue whether these confiscated mixtures were actually used for sabbats and rituals, or if they were simply folk remedies that happened to cause intense experiences. Either way, the Church didn't like them. Anything that produced visions, trances, or uncontrollable laughter was quickly framed as evidence of demonic influence. Yet, and here's the unsettling part, the same inquisitors who condemned these items often kept them. Inquisition records mention preserved oils or suspicious pastes stored in monastic cellars for further study. One friar wrote in a margin note, "This paste, when warmed and placed upon the brow, produces heat, tears, and the illusion of music." Not exactly the clinical distance you'd expect from a moral watchdog. Some apothecaries, when summoned as expert witnesses, were forced to admit that the accused herbs were also used in approved medical contexts. Belladonna for fevers, mandrake for surgery, henbane for toothaches. The only difference? Context and control. A noblewoman with a trusted physician was seen as a patient. A peasant woman with the same herbs in her apron was a suspected heretic. Quirky fact. In one French trial from 1501, the accused, a healer named Isabel, claimed she used angel wine to help patients dream of their deceased loved ones. The court labeled it devil's water. Later analysis of the recipe, found in her possessions, suggested it contained poppy syrup, sage, honey, and 2 drops of wormwood extract. Sound demonic to you? These contradictions extended into church politics. Some clergy quietly defended the use of dreaming herbs as spiritual tools. Others demanded total rejection of any mind-altering plant not explicitly found in scripture. The line between sorcery and sacrament grew razor-thin. And as witch trials escalated, fear trumped nuance. Women were especially vulnerable, particularly widows, midwives, or anyone with a little too much knowledge and a little too little protection. Possessing dried herbs became cause for interrogation. Brewing tea at the wrong hour could lead to public shaming, or worse. You stand now beside the evidence table. A glass vial glows faintly in the torchlight, filled with a syrup the color of rust. You pick it up. It smells of anise and something darker, smoke maybe. Someone probably made it for sleep, or to ease mourning, or to find a few soft hours in a brutal world. But to the men in this room it was a crime, a threat, a gateway, and so they confiscated it, catalogued it, and, if we're honest, probably sampled it behind closed doors. Because even in a time of burning stakes and iron, chains, curiosity was stronger than doctrine. You leaf through a worn, leather-bound journal in the quiet of a cloister library. Its pages crackle softly, stained with ink and the ghost of old fingers. At first, it seems like a theological diary. Dates, prayers, daily observations. But then, something shifts. A new entry begins. Last night I left my bed and walked among the stars. Your breath stills. You've just stumbled into the forgotten dream diary of a 14th century friar. His name is Brother Theobald, and for over 2 decades he served in a modest Franciscan priory nestled in the Alps. He was, by all accounts, devout, disciplined, and quietly brilliant. He also appears to have had a rich and consistent inner life that makes modern lucid dreamers look like lightweights. Each entry starts the same way. I took my draft. He doesn't specify the ingredients often, but when he does, the pattern is unmistakable. Valerian root, wormwood-infused wine, honey steeped in mugwort, and occasionally something he cryptically calls angel powder. Then comes a line about prayer, a few psalms and silence. And then the visions. He writes of walking barefoot across rivers made of mirrors, of speaking to beasts with gentle eyes who told him stories of time before Adam. He describes clouds that sing and trees that glow with words in their bark. There are angels, yes, but also a wise moth, a doorway in the moon, and once, disturbingly, a chorus of headless monks playing flutes made of bone. What's fascinating is his tone. Never frightened, never boastful, just observant, as though these nightly journeys were as routine to him as matins or fetching wood for the fire. Historians still argue about records like these. Were they the result of intentional ritual, of chronic sleep disorders? Or did friars like Theobald have private, structured methods for exploring altered consciousness? Methods that were quietly tolerated so long as the visions stayed edifying. Some scholars note the resemblance between Theobald's writings and early Sufi dream practices, which may have trickled westward via trade routes or captured texts during the Crusades. Others point out the influence of Neoplatonism, a popular mystical philosophy of the time that suggested the soul could ascend through layers of reality via contemplation, and perhaps herbal assistance. We can't know for sure. But we do know this. Theobald's descriptions include physiological symptoms familiar to modern users of mild hallucinogens: warm skin, time distortion, the feeling of drifting but not falling. A common note: my limbs are made of wind. One quirky entry describes a visit from a fellow friar who asked Theobald about his dreams. Theobald offered him a lesser draught, and that night the friend dreamt of a great field full of ladders. The next day he begged for more, but Theobald refused. Not all are called to climb, he wrote. There's a quiet brilliance to these journals, a merging of theological devotion and careful self-experimentation. Theobald never describes his experiences as miracles or magic. He calls them explorations. He thanks God for the visions, but never claims to deserve them. He simply records, reflects, and at times asks forgiveness. In the final entries, as he aged and grew frail, his dreams became more minimal. He writes of vast white rooms, of silence that hums. He no longer drinks the draughts. He says simply, "I no longer need them. The door opens anyway." You close the journal gently, the candle beside you burning low. In a time when most people dreamed of bread or fire or death, this friar carved out a private universe, a nightly cathedral made of thought, spirit, and just the right touch of Valerian. And while no one canonized him, no one burned him either. He lived, wrote, and drifted quietly between the world of men and the world behind his eyes. It's market day in a bustling medieval town. You wander past stalls, hawking onions, eels, embroidered sleeves, and, curiously, powdered roots in tiny pouches. At the end of the row, a town crier bellows news about a thief caught in the baker's. Order. But another man is being dragged through the crowd, not for stealing bread, but for selling something else entirely. The charge? Using forbidden herbs to trick the mind. Tonight, we dive into the uneasy relationship between medieval law and intoxication. Because while the church preached purity and nobles played with elixirs, the laws of the land weren't always so tolerant. Let's be clear, there was no single medieval drug law like we have today. Regulations varied wildly between kingdoms, city-states, and church jurisdictions. But if you altered your mind in the wrong way, at the wrong time, in front of the wrong person, that could get you more than a slap on the wrist. First and foremost, public intoxication, especially if it led to violence, hallucination, or unexplainable behavior, was often met with suspicion and punishment. In cities like Paris, Milan, and London, laws existed not against being high per se, but against disturbing the social order. If your dream tea made you dance barefoot in the street and shout that you were Saint Michael reincarnated, that was a problem. And then there were the bans on specific substances. Certain towns outlawed the sale of henbane or mandrake without a physician's license. Others forbade the burning of sleeping herbs within city limits. These rules weren't always enforced, but when they were harsh. Confiscation of goods, public penance, even branding in extreme cases. Still, the line between medicine and criminality remained dangerously thin. A woman caught selling poppy syrup for coughs might be thanked on Monday, and arrested on Friday if a child had a vision after drinking it. Context was everything, and gender, as usual, played a role. Women were more likely to be accused of sorcery, especially if they mixed or sold their own herbal concoctions. A man with a tonic was a doctor. A woman with one, a witch. Historians still argue whether the legal crackdown was about morality or control. Some believe authorities feared the chaos mind-altering substances could introduce into a rigidly hierarchical society. Others think it was simply a matter of who had access to these substances. If it was within the walls of a monastery or noble estate, fine. But if it showed up in the hands of peasants, travelers, or midwives, it became suspect. One of the most curious records comes from Lübeck, Germany, in 1432. A merchant returning from Constantinople was arrested for distributing what he called dream cakes to dockworkers. They were made of flour, honey, and a powder he refused to identify. Witnesses claimed the workers began speaking in rhymes, dancing for hours, and collapsing into laughter. The merchant was fined, flogged, and his recipe destroyed. But not before. Someone copied it, because of course they did. Quirky fact. In Florence, there was a brief period during the late 14th century when soothing syrups containing cannabis or poppy extract were taxed like wine. But after a surge in inappropriate hymn singing, they were reclassified as luxuries of confusion and banned in most taverns. Interestingly, some city guards and minor officials were known to use mild intoxicants themselves, especially during long night shifts. Poppy ale, in small doses, was said to sharpen the ear and soften the ache in old bones. As long as they didn't fall asleep on duty, nobody cared. And then there were the grey areas, pilgrims bringing back powders from the Holy Land, traders selling incense blends that made prayers deeper, and alchemists offering tinctures that revealed the truth of one's reflection. Technically illegal, often, frequently ignored. Also, yes, you pause now at the edge of a tavern doorway, watching a man slip a few silver coins to the barmaid in exchange for a steaming cup. Careful, she says. More than one and you might forget your name. He grins, and you realize that in a world where laws were written in ink, but enforced with glances and gossip, getting high wasn't exactly criminal. It was just dangerous. Dangerous to your reputation, your position, your freedom. Not because of what you did, but because of what you saw, and what you might say afterward. Because the real fear wasn't the laughter, or the dancing, or the songs. It was what happened when someone saw the world differently and started talking about it. The wind has changed. It smells of parchment, orange peel, and something faintly electric, like the air just before a storm. You're standing in a scholar's chamber near the university walls of Florence, late in the 15th century. Outside, the bells toll for vespers, but inside, a fire crackles under a suspended flask, and a young man in scholar's robes leans over a parchment scrawled with diagrams. It's almost ready, he whispers. I've measured it against the stars. This isn't magic. It's the Renaissance, and with it came a shift. Away from blind faith and toward inquiry. But sometimes that inquiry took scholars not into the heavens, but inward, deep into the folds of their own minds. As humanism bloomed and classical texts returned to the shelves of Europe's brightest, so too did curiosity about the self, the soul, and what happens when you alter perception. What had once been framed as sorcery was now being relabeled, gently, as experiment. Let's start with Giovanni da Ravenna, a little-known but widely read scholar who in 1492 recorded a series of nocturnal meditations he undertook while sipping a bitter tea brewed from marubium and crushed dream leaves. Modern researchers think he was using wild lettuce, or blue lotus, both known for their sedative, sometimes euphoric effects. He describes entering a grey river of silence, speaking with a voice he called the mirror, and returning, with a new understanding of Aristotle's physics. Impressive and deeply suspicious. Giovanni was far from alone. During the early Renaissance, polymaths across Italy, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire began playing with the boundary between philosophy and pharmacology. They referenced herbs used by the ancients, nepenthe from Homer, or the wine of Lethe. Scholars and students alike began to test the effects of poppy syrup, cannabis extract, and imported tonics not just to dull pain, but to heighten insight. And the results? Complicated. Some reported expanded clarity, others claimed to unlock hidden truths, or to hear divine music behind geometry. A few confessed to terrifying journeys, encounters with shadow figures or being lost in spirals. But the drive to explore didn't stop. If anything, it accelerated. Historians still argue whether this was true scientific curiosity or just an elevated form of thrill-seeking. But the documentation is clear. Journals, letters, and experimental notes often include detailed descriptions of subjective experience, long before modern psychology or neuroscience gave us a framework. One especially quirky tale involves Marsilio Ficino, the famous Florentine philosopher who translated Plato. Ficino wrote about a spiritual wine he crafted from sage, rose petals, honey, and a hint of somniferous seed. He claimed it prepared the soul for contemplation of the eternal. Modern guesses, possibly a trace of opium poppy, though he never named it directly. Ficino warned against overuse. To climb too high is to lose the world, he wrote. One must return, lest wisdom turn to flame. A surprisingly responsible, tripping manifesto, really. And this wasn't limited to Italy. In Prague, early alchemists blended their quests for transformation with psychoactive elixirs. Some even infused their mystical diagrams. mandalas, spirals, tree of life symbols, with notes about what herbs should be consumed before contemplating them. Drink first the draught of slow fire, one manuscript reads, then stare until the eye no longer blinks. Even the visual arts may have been affected. Scholars debate whether certain surreal or visionary motifs in late Gothic and early Renaissance painting, elongated figures, swirling skies, saints staring at unseen wonders, were inspired by actual altered states. We can't prove it, but we can say the timeline overlaps. And artists talk to apothecaries more than they let on. Of course, the church still loomed. These experiments had to be framed in philosophical or theological terms. Anything too wild, too unchristian, too pleasure-focused risked condemnation. So the language stayed elevated. Divine communion, mental expansion, celestial cognition. But the door had opened. People were beginning to ask not just what was real, but how we perceive reality, and whether that perception could be gently rearranged. You stand now in the flickering firelight as the scholar hands you a tiny glass vial. For clarity, he says, a drop only. You hesitate, then sip. It tastes like bitter clover and something metallic. The room doesn't change, but your thoughts do, and for a moment you understand. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and reason. It was also a rebirth of exploration, not just of stars and machines, but of the mind itself, and the quiet alchemy that happens when we ask, what else could there be? You return to a place that feels familiar now. A small cottage on the edge of a field, where smoke curls from a crooked chimney, and the evening sun sets everything in gold. Inside, a kettle steams quietly, filling the air with the scent of thyme, lavender, and something just a bit sharp. You sit on a stool by the hearth as a gentle old voice says, "Just one more story before sleep, and this one is yours. After everything you've seen, monks whispering over mandrake roots, noblemen sipping poppy wine, dancers collapsing in ecstatic laughter, friars floating through honey-colored visions. After all the elixirs, potions, powders, and plants, one truth rises gently to the surface like steam from the cup in your hand. The medieval world was never sober. Not in the sense we imagine today. Not dull, not grim. Not always tethered to the dirt and the dark and the pain of plagues and penance. It was a world alive with sensation, with curiosity, with a yearning to soften the hard edges of reality, even just for a moment. Whether by intention or accident, people sought altered states, to dull pain, to chase dreams, to speak to gods, to quiet grief, to dance themselves into a trance when words or prayers were no longer enough. And it wasn't limited to one class, or one country, or one purpose. It was everywhere. The monk sipping mugwort under candlelight, the peasant chewing datura berries to forget hunger, the apothecary grinding henbane into a sleeping draught for a widow who hadn't slept since Easter, the inquisitor labeling a flying ointment heretical by day and testing it by night. Historians still argue, they always will, about dosage, intent, interpretation, but the experiences speak for themselves, scrawled in margins, etched in trial records, whispered in song. Even today we live with their ghosts. In the herbs we brew. In the incense we burn. In the stories we tell of flying broomsticks and mushroom-eating saints. These aren't just relics, they're echoes of a world that never stopped asking, what if? Quirky fact. Somewhere in a monastery archive sits a recipe labeled to loosen the mind, but not lose it. And honestly, isn't that what most of us want? Now the fire has burned low, the herbs in your cup are steeped, the room is warm, and the shadows have softened. You feel it, the subtle sway behind your eyelids. the gentle weightlessness of surrender. Let yourself drift, let the visions pass like clouds. The medieval world was high, often and in more ways than one, and now so are you. Let your breath slow now, let it deepen. You've wandered through centuries tonight, through cloisters and kitchens, gardens and gallows, alchemy labs and smoky taverns. You've heard the whisper of crushed leaves, the laughter of saints who forgot they were human, and the soft bubbling of elixirs stirred in the half-light. The fire in your mind is glowing lower now. The images grow quieter, their edges softer, more forgiving. A monk closes his book. A friar stops his chant mid-note. A bottle is stoppered, a candle pinched out, a sigh released into the silence. You are not in a field or a castle or a chapel anymore. You are in your bed. Maybe you can hear the hum of a fan, maybe just the rhythm of your own breath. But beneath it all is the echo of something older, a world that dreamed while awake, that saw visions in firelight, that brewed comfort from roots and leaves. And in a strange way, you carry that world with you. Every time you light a candle. Every time you close your eyes and slip into a dream you don't fully understand. So rest, traveler. You've earned it. Let go of the questions. Let go of the names of herbs and the dates of trials. Let the stories blur and fade and fold into each other. Let the silence hold you, gently, like hands beneath water. And if you dream of stars, or saints, or animals that speak, don't worry. You're not hallucinating. You're just remembering.